little bit about the history of sexual biology in humans. And we can't talk about that without bringing up our good old friend, Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud, so this right here, there's been a lot of missteps and a lot of positive steps in the history of sexology. And so there, I like to call these open doors and closed doors. So Sigmund Freud really helped us understand that sexuality and sex is something that we develop over time. You aren't born with it. Children don't really have sexuality. They develop it through time. And so that's really kind of the key lesson that we learned from Sigmund Freud. Outside of that, he introduced a whole bunch of problematic ideas that are quite difficult. And this really this outlines the most problematic of them all. In his understanding of the development of sex, he developed something that we think of today as kind of a hierarchy of different kinds of sex, or kind of good sex and bad sex. And in reality, all sex is good. If it's legal and you're not hurting anybody, it's great. So he starts out his hierarchy of sex with oral sex, anal sex, association with the phallic organ, latency, understandings of genital. But really what he was really into was the gold standard, which is penetrative, insertive, vaginal sex. He defined sex as sticking a wiener in a vagina. And if any of you have ever had sex, you might know that that is a form of sex, but it isn't the only form of sex. And it also isn't the way that we as humans and most intelligent animals on Earth have sex. They have sex because it feels good, not because they're trying to achieve reproduction. A lot of people in the world and most animals don't have sex because they think they're going to make a baby. They have sex because it feels good. Which then leads us to our other really famous sexologist, Masters and Johnson, who knew that sex felt good. In fact, most of their studies centered around hooking up people to cameras and heart rate monitors in order to understand what happened to them physiologically when they had sex. So this was really great because they helped us identify that pleasure was a really important part of what motivated humans and animals to have sex. So that was kind of the open door that they provided for us. Where they got it wrong was they really focused on orgasm, and they loved focusing on male orgasm. So they kind of never really figured out that there was a clitoris. And it took them a long time, and it actually took Masters, the woman involved in these studies, to start thinking about pleasure and organs that are solely dedicated to the production of pleasure, which would be the clitoris. Men out there who aren't aware of this. As a gay man, I often have to teach men where and what the clitoris is, which I find very ironic. But the key thing with Masters and Johnson is that pleasure is the main motivator, but also that orgasm isn't indicative of sex. You don't have to have an orgasm to have sex, okay? Sex can be a whole bunch of different levels and variations of pleasure. So they really focused on this cycle that they formulated, and penetrative, insertive, vaginal sex, and an explosion of male orgasm, which is actually quite limiting when we started to learn about sex. And then we have kind of our godfather of queer biology, Alfred Kinsey. So Alfred Kinsey was the first biologist to really come mainstream. He used to be an entomologist who studied gall wasps. He didn't get any fame, no fortune, no money from that dissertation. And then he started teaching classes, and he found that most of his students had a huge ignorance of what pleasure was, what sex was, what different kinds of sex are possible among humans, and he did giant surveys. And if you've ever watched any, there's several documentaries about him, and there's also a really famous movie about him as well, which stars Liam Neeson and some other good actors. And really what his contribution to science was that everything kind of falls on a gradient. Everything kind of falls on a continuum. And that's why I have this rainbow flag here and the famous Kinsey scale. Where do you fall on the Kinsey scale? Are you asexual? Are you solely attracted to same gender? Or are you solely attracted to different gender? Or do you fall in between? Or does it depend on what you had for breakfast that morning? So there's been a lot of effort focusing in on sex and the reasons why humans have sex and why we like to have sex. It's actually been quite a huge topic in biology. And just recently, we've had a lot of studies that have started to bring animals out of the closet. And this has been really, really jarring for a lot of old theories. So here are some books that if you really want to dig deep into the topic that you can read into. These are New York Times bestsellers like Dr. Tatiana's Sex Guide, Sex Advice to All of Creation. Things that are a little bit heavy and deal with a little bit of evolutionary theory like Evolution's Rainbow, which is a Stanford professor who I had the pleasure of studying under. Or Biological Exuberance, which is a survey and a field guide of all the ways of doing it in the animal kingdom. Focuses a lot on birds and it focuses a lot on mammals, so that way we feel a little bit more close to them, both evolutionarily and then also in terms of how they have sex. But what this has really been confirming is that same-sex sexuality is common. In any organism that we've looked for it, we've found it, whether it's innate or circumstantial. This includes every single major vertebrate group. So these are all of the mammals, all of the birds, reptiles and amphibians, arachnids, and a whole bunch of other organisms that we've probably never heard of. So same-sex sexuality is not new to science. And one of the things that's really surprising about this work is it took a long time for the biologist to kind of come out of the closet. So I'm a bird biologist, Matt's a dinosaur biologist, and Jen is a frog biologist. And we kind of identify with our animals. And it took a lot of bravery among men who are scientists, and also it took a lot of the perspectives of women and queer people in biology to finally come down out of the mountains, for example, with the bighorn sheep and say, they're all gay. Because it had a huge impact. It kind of reflects on you, right? The strength of Tyrannosaurus is the strength of Matt, or the prettiness of birds as a reflection on me as a pretty man. So when we tend to wrap up our own identities in our organisms, and it took a long time for these animals to kind of come out of the closet. Not because they were embarrassed or they thought there was anything wrong with the way they were doing it. It was because there is a bias, there is a lens, there is a way in which we construct the way that our animals go about their day-to-day business and how they reproduce, and how does that reflect on me if my birds are gay? With that, all the other examples of same-sex sexuality, which none of these animals I would ever say are actually gay. They tend to kind of have a gradient, and they're not fixed in any way. So they may have same-sex sexual encounters in the morning, and then in the evening have a different sex sexual encounter. So they don't kind of carry that baggage of identity that we've applied to them. So when I use any words like gay or bi or anything like that, they don't really apply to these animals. I'm just using them because I have to use English to communicate with you. On top of all this same-sex sexuality that's starting to pour out of the literature, and that happened around 1999 is when animals started to finally kind of parade out of the closet, we started paying a little bit more attention to our ancestors. So all of you in this room have soft, squishy bodies with bones on the inside. So you're very different than insects. So if you remove insects from our evolutionary family and only focus on the mollusks and the fish and the reptiles and amphibians and the birds and mammals, 1/3 of all of those mammals don't even have separate sexes. They're simultaneously male and female at the same time, or they switch from being male to female based off of their age or based off of their social circumstances. And so this is not a small number, 65,000 species that we know of. So your ancestors had no understanding of what was male and what was female. The other thing that's really kind of important about you is you have a backbone. So that puts you in a special group of organisms that we call vertebrates. So every single one of you in this room is related to a fish. And a great deal of your DNA you have in common with fish. And something that's really surprising about fish is over 700 species and counting switch between male and female, or female and male, or back and forth during their life cycle. And this can happen within hours to days of something happening. So here's an example of a fish with a fantastic scientific name at the bottom, which changes from male to female when in need of a male or a female within their population. And this is not these trans organisms, these organisms that don't fit the binary of male or female, aren't relegated to just fish, but this happens among organisms that are warm-blooded and social, like mammals and birds. So we have lots and lots of examples of birds that don't tend to fit the binary. And these are kind of two examples. Hummingbirds, they show a lot of transitioning in terms of how they wear their plumage and how they signal to one another. They will often shift back and forth between male plumage and female plumage. There's a lot of mystery and misunderstanding around why they do this. I don't have a good explanation of why they do it. I just know that they do it as somebody who has 200,000 birds in a museum. And then we have other good examples like the hyena. So the hyena, this is a female hyena. Hyenas are matriarchal mammals. It means that the females are bigger and stronger and dominant. The lowest ranking female in the pack is higher ranking than the males. They also have what scientists have kind of deemed what they call a pseudo-penis. I just like to call it a really long clitoris. They actually give birth through it. And these are not the only examples. These are just kind of the most interesting examples to show on a slide for you. So I've gotten started on this talk, and mine's a little bit more serious. I can say the F word too, Matt, but and hyenas fuck. Hyenas fuck, just so you know. But what I want to, this is sex ed, and I worry that our bar-going population here might not know what a female is or what a male is. Or they might not know why animals have sex in the first place. Why do we have sex? What's the purpose of sex? Is it feel good? Is it for fucking? So these are the two lessons that I want you to carry out. This is your sex education. So what is a male and what is a female? So here I have a couple examples of how medical doctors. So medical doctor, I went to school for many years with lots of medical doctors who did a lot of memorizing. They're very good at memorizing. I'm sure I have some in the audience here. But we kind of trusted them to come up with definitions of what makes a male and a female. And they've gotten it wrong throughout history. They spent a lot of time, they focused a lot on genitals in the first place. And so right here I have a phallometer. This is something that they use. So if your baby girl or baby boy was born, and I don't even like to really apply those categories to little children when they're being born, but the first thing they did was they measured the wiener, or the clitoris, in order to determine, do you have a boy or do you have a girl? And so this is the phallometer. If the phallus and the clitoris and the penis are homologous, meaning that they're the same thing. They come from the same materials, right? Same way your scrotum and the labia are the same thing. The ovaries and the testes are the same thing. When you start out in the womb, you are all the same, and then you start to kind of go down a path with lots of tricky twists and turns and hundreds of genes turning on and off, and it's a very difficult journey in order to actually be born, so that you either fall on the phallometer as just a girl, or wow, baby, you hit the jackpot. But there's a gray area, and as many people know in this room, there's a lot of different sizes and shapes of our phalluses out there. Male phalluses tend to be urinated out of and also to deliver sperm. Female phalluses are solely geared towards pleasure. They have the same number of nerve endings as the penis, but in a much more compact, tighter area. And so when the phallus turned out to be between these measurements, doctors would surgically intervene. Ooh, yeah. So that's something that's actually being changed. Hopefully it's been changed in Germany. It's something that's kind of on the docket here in the United States as well, in terms of like, let them grow, let them figure out what they are, because there's been a lot of mistakes made, especially if you watch any of those 2020 specials with John Mooney, the doctor who really tried to like push theories about being born either a male or a female. And so what I'm trying to get across here is there's a lot of gray area when you get into genitals. So that doesn't work. The other thing that doctors tend to rely on, and if you look up the definition of biological sex in the dictionary, they will often use chromosomes. So chromosomes are just DNA that's been packed up in these little packages. This is kind of X that we have here. We have 23 of them plus our sex chromosomes. And these are the sex chromosomes, the X and the Y. And these are actual photos of them. The Y chromosome is actually kind of this little tiny deformed, very few genes on it as well. It's not necessary as well. Women in this room are quite fine without the Y chromosome. It doesn't add a lot of extra. It really has a couple genes that are a couple switches that kind of help you go down one path or another. So XX, we have 2 copies of the X chromosome. When you are developing as a human being, a few days after conception, one of the X's is silenced because you only need one X. So all of the XX women in this room, they are expressing one chromosome or another chromosome in different parts of their body. You're all wonderful mosaics. Or anybody here in this room who is an XY chromosome holder, you only have one X chromosome, which you inherited from your mother, and you express that throughout your entire body, so you have less genetic library in your cells to build upon. But XY and XX are not the only chromosomes that we have out there. You can have triple X, you can have XYY, you can have XO. And then there are even cases of many multiples of X's, many multiples of Y's. Those tend to be very rare. Sometimes they come with certain health issues. Sometimes they come with nothing. So this idea that XX and XY is a clear-cut definition of sex also kind of blurs and it falls along a continuum. So that doesn't work because of a definition of intersex. And then if you start to look at animals that don't blend their sex chromosomes throughout their entire body, where when they first start to split as a fertilized egg, their splitting is extremely organized. So the left cells become the left side of the body, and the right cells become the right side of the body. In mammals, and especially in humans, the division of cells is very random and very asynchronous, but within birds and within insects, that is not the case. So this is an example to show you of what we call a mosaic or a gynandromorph, where the first cell divisions, when the egg was fertilized, there was a aneuploidy, where the chromosomes were not the same, meaning that one side of the chicken became female, over here in the pink, and one side of the chicken became male. And this is something you'll see in lobsters, you'll see this in butterflies, you'll see this in birds. We have this in humans as well, but it's all mixed up. So the idea that everybody here has all 30 trillion cells in your body are identical is really not true. So if that's not true, what is sex? What is biological sex? So biological sex comes down to, if you're a biologist, not a medical doctor, sex cell size. So do you produce sperm or do you produce egg? And early thinking behind why a sperm cell and an egg cell evolved had to do with sexual conflict at the very earliest stages of evolution. So the idea from biologists in the early 1900s was there was a population of organisms that were sending out sex cells into the ocean, and they wanted those sex cells to meet and touch and become a brand new, diverse organism that's never been seen on Earth before. We're going to share our genes across distances, across shallows, across oceans. And if you're going to produce sex cells, you can produce them as the same size. And if you do that, the probability of those sex cells bumping into one another is what we call isogamy, goes way, way down. It would be the equivalent of me and Matt standing across a room and throwing volleyballs at each other and hoping that two of those volleyballs hit. You know, I have 5 volleyballs, he has 5 volleyballs. We have 5 chances. If we don't touch, we never reproduce. Well, the evolution of sex is actually the evolution of, it's the physics of love, the physics of touch. So if you're trying to touch, it's much more probable to have 1 or 2 giant beach balls. I'll have the beach balls, Matt. And I'll give you 1,000,000 little marbles and you can throw them all and he gets 1,000,000 little chances. And all we need is 1 marble to touch 1 beach ball and bam, we got a baby. Unfortunately, the biologists in the early 1920s tried to develop the theories around this and explain it, and what they did is they used sexual conflict, and they said that, well, Chase is really, really generous and really nurturing. So when Matt screws up and decides to cheat at the game of sex and say, I'm not going to invest very much in these sex cells, so he starts producing tiny, little, crappy sperm. Because he wants more of the evolutionary pie. He can throw marbles for days. And what happens is our babies aren't surviving, right? We're producing these crappy little babies because you're producing crappy little sperm, so I have to compensate. Well, it is. So even at the cellular level, scientists were gendered, and they were all men because if you don't remember, in the 1950s, women weren't even allowed to take lab. They had to go to home ec, and women were sent to home ec while the guys were sent to lab. So it took a lot of change in order for women to come in and be like, great, sometimes we're nurturing, sometimes we're not. And so there was this evolutionary, this sexual conflict that they supposedly took place. And in reality, the evolution of sex is a cooperative act. And that all boils down to what was the reason behind why we have sex in the first place. So now we all know here what a male and a female is. A male and a female is sperm and eggs. And animals can be simultaneously produce sperm and eggs within one body. So you can use they, them, their pronouns, and they really are producing sperm in some cases and egg in some cases, and sometimes simultaneously. So this cooperative act of sex. So what is sex? Why do we have sex? Sex is not, especially in the earliest forms of evolution, it was not because it felt good. It's because it is a great evolutionary strategy for dealing with change. It is costly, like throwing cells out into the ocean, especially your crappy little sperm. It also opens you up to a bunch of predation and a lot of diseases and things like that. It's quite risky, especially at the cellular level. So there had to be something really, there had to be an incentive why organisms would want to communicate, why they would want to touch, physically, mechanically share DNA. So this is an example of the earliest kinds of sex that we have. This is 2 bacteria that have created what we call a sex pillus. I don't know why I like that word. And they essentially form a bridge between each other, and they shuttle genes. Usually this is one directional, and it does not always happen within a single strain of bacteria. This can happen between strains. So our earliest form of sex was not some sexual conflict, battle of the sexes, I'm gonna have more babies and force you to make more of them. It really boiled down to creating diversity in order to deal with change. And there is a big cost to this, besides just the predation and the disease risks. It cuts the population growth of a species in half. So in this room, let's say we have 50-50 males and females, and if this becomes like the Starship Enterprise or something, we're gonna go repopulate the next planet we come to, we would get one baby for every two of you in here, because it would take two people to make one baby, versus an asexual population where their reproductive capacity would be one baby for every person in here. So asexuality is actually a really fast way of reproducing. So organisms across a lot of different evolutionary lineages have evolved to have sex. And they've all kind of evolved to have this physical way of communicating, which is a small set of gametes and a large set of gametes, or in the case of bacteria, a sex pilus for shuttling back and forth. And when you get into fungus as well, they also have similar strategies for shuttling genes through their hyphae and their septa. So this gets to the organisms that we have that have sex when it's convenient. So these are Daphnia and aphids. So any of you garden here in Pittsburgh, which is a lovely place to garden, aphids are a good example of organisms that have sex when it's necessary, and they reproduce asexually when they're trying to grow. So when there's a whole bunch of tomatoes in your garden and they're trying to grow as fast as possible in order to eat them as much as they can, they switch over to asexual reproduction and they just pump out babies like crazy. And just before the winter comes, it almost seems randomly, males start to appear, males start to get born, and then males quickly move around from population to population, bringing genes. And they bring genes that may be good and they may be bad, but what they'll do is they'll create diversity among the different populations, so that way if it gets really cold, or there's a disease, or if some new predator shows up, we don't have all of our eggs in one basket. Not all of us are copies of one another, but we're all diverse. So it's a cooperative act. Sex is a cooperative act in order to create diversity so we aren't all screwed when Armageddon comes. So then we move up the line and we move into multicellular organisms, and a lot of us, we've been backed into an evolutionary corner as well. We inherit things from our fish ancestors, from our bacterial ancestors, from our dinosaur, we don't have any dinosaur ancestors, but birds do. So when you start to move into sex systems that have these sperm delivery systems where the male is in one partitioned body, so there is no non-binary organisms where they both produce egg and sperm at the same time. But that doesn't mean that you have two sexes, right? You still have sperm and egg, and you can still classify an organism by its gametes, not its genitals, not its chromosomes, not its phallus, but really by its behavior and its template. So what we have is the difference between sexes, which are those gametes that I talked about, and then everything else is gender. And this is a good example of an organism. It's called a ruff. It's a bird that lives in Scandinavia. It's fantastic. It's a very scary dinosaur. It would kick Spinosaurus's ass. And there are 3 different types of males, and they have different roles and different functions. We currently think of just kind of having kind of one gendered female, right? There's a lot of variation around that female. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are different. And then the males also have their clustering around kind of 3 different templates. They have different genes, they have different colors, they have different behaviors, and they have different strategies. And so these different strategies are employed, and some of them do better in certain circumstances, and some of them do worse. It depends on the year. It's a strategy, it's an evolutionary stable strategy for dealing with change. So this is just a silly little cartoon to kind of help you understand what's going on here. But these 3 males kind of work as a team in order to deliver sperm. So we have males that hold territories. The male that holds a territory and spends a lot of time courting the female is right here, this kind of big, darker colored one. This lighter colored one here in the corner, it spends the whole year with the females, kind of helping them out, feeding them, kind of becoming their best friends, kind of like I've done with some of my friends. I've been a very good wingman. I bring him to the bar, buy him a drink. I go, oh, this is Lethan. He's very great. He's wonderful. And then there are also these female mimics, which are males that seem to look like females. We don't have any evidence that shows that the females are kind of tricked. They definitely probably recognize them as females, so their role is really kind of misunderstood in biology. But what I'm just trying to say here is they exist. So this idea of 2 genders doesn't work in humans, and it certainly doesn't work in birds. Here's another example of when you might have a sperm delivery system that isn't just one organism, but what they do is they kind of form a superorganism. So the way that this has been written up in the biological literature is that there's this long-tailed mannequin, and we got an alpha male and a beta male, which is kind of some weird language that they use. These two birds spend their entire lives together. They're not related, which was kind of tough for a lot of biologists to swallow. They thought they were like brothers or cousins or something. They tend to be more like lovers. They spend all their time together, and based on how well they dance as a coordinated superorganism determines whether or not they'll be able to attract a female. And so this type of system is very common in birds. It's also common among insects, where we have two males who kind of work cooperatively in order to breed with a female. It's all about trying to get that offspring, not about fighting with one another. We have done lots and lots and lots of science to try to back up theories about why one male is getting the mating over another male, and all data is inconclusive. All right, so we talked about males and females and having sex, and that's great and all, but the purpose of having sex is to produce offspring. And so when males are more than a sperm delivery system, okay? So when males can actually become social and become active and actually do something besides just deliver sperm localized to different females, they can be useful. So fish are kind of the champions. Fish fathers rock. Most fish that parent, the males do the vast majority of the parenting. Kind of the star of this would be seahorses and pipefish, where they kind of give birth to their babies. They have a specially developed pouch. The female lays her eggs in that pouch. The male gets pregnant. The male gives birth. It's fascinating. This is not just relegated to our relatives in the ocean. Here's a good example of a male bat that lactates and gives milk to its baby. So all you men out there who didn't know why you had nipples, I'm just saying. So this other idea that males are not nurturing in the bird world and the mammal world as well, but this is a good example. Whenever you see a greater rhea with their babies, that's a dad with all of its babies. The females are very promiscuous in this system. They aren't tied up with baby rearing. It's actually the males that do that. We have plenty of examples like this, and science doesn't know why one species picks one strategy or another. These are pretty simple organisms as well. We'll get into some of the more complex ones that are a little bit more. And the other thing is variation. If you look at a field notebook or you watch a documentary, everything would kind of lay out a kind of a heteronormative idea, or even a monogamous or a two-person player game. Here is a wonderful, famous example of the Bald Eagle Trio in Illinois, 2019. This is their second time that they've done this. This is a same-sex pair of males who breed with a female, a lucky female every year, and they breed cooperatively. This is just another strategy. So what you might see in evolution would be, if this is a really, really good, efficient strategy for maybe a change in the environment or some other difference, this might be a winning strategy. And so therefore that's how we would see multiplayer kind of games coming into evolution, this kind of invasion of a new template. And by no means is it rare to see these types of arrangements of families. They might actually be really, really successful in a changing world. For example, climate change might really be affecting the food. So if you have 3 hunters at your nest bringing food to the nest, this might be kind of a game changer evolutionarily. And this is kind of the exciting breakneck things that happen in evolution. It usually kind of takes one really innovative strategy. Things tend to be really efficient, though, in monogamous two-player systems, especially among birds. So here are the same-sex examples of emperor penguins. There's a lot of good theories that are starting to gain a lot of support about why penguins tend to be so homosexual, and also albatross. So there's a lot of female-female and male-male same-sex couples. And one thing that they've seen, especially among emperor penguins, is they are awesome at adopting babies and eggs that only have about a minute on the ice before they die. So not all parents are good parents, and sometimes you need a gay couple in the mix in order to pick up the slack. We start moving into these animals that have more complex social systems, hierarchies. They take a little bit longer in order for them to develop their family structures and their social structures. So lions, for example, are very homosexual, especially when you look at the way that the females bond with one another, create kind of groups or families with one another, and how males, especially brothers and males who form strong alliances between one another, when you work together with another individual, you tend to be stronger, and then you can take over a pride, you can be more successful. So there's a lot of support showing that lions that tend to be a little queer tend to be a little more successful than those that are lone, strong wolves, or lions in this case. Bighorn sheep, this is a really important example here. We have two beautiful dioramas of these in the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. We're working on updating some of our language around them, but this is the gayest animal I have ever come across in my career. So all you out there with your Dodge Ram trucks, you go, girl, you go. The bighorn sheep is a star in the world of queer biology. About 95% of the males, or 97% of the males, go through a period of intense homosexuality, the Hunger Games of homosexuality, where in order to work your way up in the ranks of the social system of the bighorn sheep, you have to learn how to fuck in your gay circle. And then once you become the top dog and the dominant male, the alpha male system, you are finally able to go and breed with the females. So any reproductively successful bighorn sheep on Earth went through a very intense homosexual period in order to learn how to have sex. There are lots of studies, and there is the identification of a very, very tiny minority of strictly heterosexual bighorn sheep. They spend all of their time with the females. They never let males have sex with them, and they are the bottoms. They only let females mount them. The females use them as kind of their sex toys, and they have lots and lots of sex with females, but they never conceive of an offspring. So just to kind of flip that on your head, just because you think about a male having sex, that doesn't necessarily mean that the male is having sex with the female. Females have sex with males, and there's a lot of homosexuality going on between these ungulates among the females. This is especially true among like white-tailed deer that you all see in your backyard. Female white-tailed deer form extremely intense bonds. They intimately touch. They take care of each other as fawns, and about 1 month out of the year, they'll start to hang out with the males in order to conceive an offspring, and then the males will go off into their bachelor groups, where females will have intense, long-term female-female relationships. And then we move to the animals that are just smart enough to be themselves. And this is where we start to get into kind of the gray area of identity, animals that have unique personalities, animals that know what they like, animals that are really motivated by pleasure, animals whose biology is not dependent on the survival of an individual, but are really dependent on the survival of a group or a family, okay? And so families and groups that work together in order to share resources and to share food. This is true among the great apes. That's what you are. If you are if you are a silverback gorilla or a dominant chimpanzee or a dominant female bonobo, because the females are all dominant in that group, there are plenty of studies out there that show that those that share resources, those that nurture, and those that cooperate do far better than those that have a kind of a competitive, conflicting society. Not to say that they don't have those out there, but they tend to do worse in the long term, those that are working together. And then also we have our other animals that are highly intelligent and have different forms of sex. These animals are also, I would venture to say that they're moving into the area of having kind of an identity. There's a lot of evidence that shows that these animals speak language, have a language, they have names for each other, they have culture, if you could use that word. In this case, if you move killer whales from two different pods into one enclosure, they can't really talk to each other. It's like putting somebody from somebody who speaks one language with another person with another language, and they pass on their knowledge through their family groups. The other thing that's really kind of exciting about killer whales is their families. Males live to be about 30 years old. Females live to be about 80 years old. It's another example of an organism that goes through menopause. So the females in killer whales are the most valuable because they carry all of the cultural information about where to hunt, where to go, what to do from year to year. And so they're all based off of these grandmother systems. And so it's really kind of mimicking what we see in bonobos and also what we see in humans in terms of the value of women and females in these systems. And then finally, we're just starting to kind of like understanding a little bit more about humans and human sexuality. I have a big problem with evolutionary psychology. I think it's kind of a bankrupt field where they take science from monkeys and birds and bats and butterflies and try to apply it in really awkward ways. And so the only thing I can really tell you about humans is, be yourself, do what feels good. But one thing that's kind of hopeful and interesting to know with these twin studies that have been going on for many decades is that we are starting to see that there is kind of an equal part of some sort of genetic relationship in terms of sexual identity. It tends to run in families, both males and females. There tends to be a case if you're twins separated at birth, there's a higher likelihood that you'll share the same sexuality as your twin, the same gender identity. This is also true with trans people as well. But then also there's some evidence that shows that it is also related to the environment that you grow up in and your personal experiences. One thing that I kind of want to leave you with is to kind of think about this idea that nurture and nature don't need to be separated the way we've tried to separate males and females, and we can kind of start approaching things with nurture and nature. Especially when you deal with evolution, they tend to get really blurry and hard to distinguish and separate. And then I just want to reiterate your sex education. So everyone here now knows what the difference between a male and a female is, I hope. It has to do with sex cells. And then the last thing is, why do we have sex? It's to create diversity. So you should embrace diversity. Diversity is a great thing for you all to be having. We should be trying to encourage it. It brings in a lot of perspectives. In fact, companies have found that you're able to tackle problems and deal with problems in a more creative way with new solutions, novel solutions, if you incorporate new perspectives. And we've definitely seen that in biology by finally letting women and queer people practice science. And then finally, I'm just going to end really quickly and say, coming soon to a museum near you, a much more friendly presentation of the science of sex, gender, and identity. Nature's Rainbow is an exhibit that I've been working on with a wonderful team of educators and artists at the museum. And we're in the early stages, fundraising and planning things, but yeah, you'll be able to walk through an immersive environment that'll kind of teach you some of these fun lessons. And with that, I'll take any questions. We don't have anything. We don't have to.
Good evening.
Yep.
So, from my understanding, birds have cloacas, correct?
Yeah.
Are there, it's a little bit graphic, but are there any birds with gonopodiums or visible sexual organs?
So the question, he was a little shy to ask, but his question was, do birds have penises? And the short answer is no, they're just a drag, okay? They just drag and they just flop around there. Birds are all about aerodynamics and reducing weight. So in fact, A true penis is not something that any bird has. They have a lot of them have sperm delivery devices. Not a lot of them. Ducks, rheas, a few groups of them have something to kind of shuttle sperm from one to another. But most birds have what they call a cloaca, and they have sex, which is just kind of like an opening. Cloaca is a Greek word for opening, for sewer. And the real question is do all mammals have penises? And the answer is no. So there's a whole bunch of rodents out there that have cloaca. So penises are kind of uniquely mammal, especially how we know them. And humans tend to have kind of the most intricate penis in the mammal world. We've been worshipping them for so many millennia that they do more than most penises do in the mammal world. There's a lot of funny theories out there, but they tend to be unique, especially among primates. They don't have a bone in them. The ratio, the size tends to be fairly large relative to the body, and it might have a lot to do with signaling. Signaling in terms of showing arousal. And the other question is yeah, well, the other answer to that would be that female genitalia also signal. It's a little bit more concealed in humans, not nearly as explicit as it is in some other mammals. There's a lot of ideas about what that, but there's just no consensus. But yeah, there are some birds that have kind of I would call a sperm delivery device.
So in one of the earlier slides, you showed that species of bird where all three males look very distinct from each other. Do they kind of form a group of three? Do they like hang out as a group, as a team, or do they just kind of come together when needed to do different functions or to attract a mate?
So the question was about the ruffs with the three males, one that was distinctly colored, kind of black or red, and then one that's white. Those two form a team, and the way to kind of quickly answer that would be that the white one kind of brokers a marriage, brokers a relationship with the larger, darker one, and then the fader, the one that looks kind of like a female, usually just kind of hangs out with the females. I don't think there's been enough study done to really know what the sexual soap opera is with those birds and who gets what percentage of breedings. But we do know that it's heritable, right? So it's something that's really unique, not very unique, but it's something that's kind of special in the biological world where you have a stable state where you have multiple players in it. So there's kind of 3 axes, or in this case 4 axes, and they've created kind of a stable state where one year you might get more white ones, one year you might get more female mimics, another year you might get like a dark colored one, but it's a stable enough relationship that one doesn't kind of eclipse the other and kind of drive it extinct. And so we see that in a group of other animals that have these kind of gender templates. But yeah, it's still up in the air. You should become an ornithologist. I'm sure you'll become famous.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I guess I have 2 questions. One, for organisms who reproduce asexually, are all their offsprings clones of each other? And the second one is about meiosis. That the recombination during meiosis, is that another way to ensure diversity?
Yeah. So the first question was, when animals reproduce asexually, are they creating clones? Exactly. They are cloning themselves, which is where the risk is. There is chances of small, minute differences in DNA as you move through time. For example, identical twins, have the same DNA, but from the moment of conception, we can now see that there can be experiences that might change the expression of different DNA, or even maybe like knocking out certain things. So we're starting to get a better understanding of DNA being operational. It's not just a book in a library, but it can be something that's functional, that can turn off genes and turn on genes. For example, there are studies where you can take a mouse and scare the crap out of it, and the babies from that mouse will inherit that trauma. So there's a whole field kind of opening up in this behavioral ecology of kind of inheriting behavioral traits. So, but the short answer is yes, asexuality is a clone. And then the next question was meiosis. That's a fun word. That's critical to sex. So mitosis is just all of the cells in your body just growing and splitting kind of normally. It happens at a very high rate in the womb, which is why we don't like anybody who's pregnant to go through x-rays, because you're splitting cells at a super high rate. And the question was, is meiosis a strategy for creating diversity? And absolutely it is. So in the earliest phases of producing sperm and egg in humans, there's a lot of crisscrossing and mixing and matching and moving around of DNA on the chromosomes. And the purpose of that is it's another additional step in getting more diversity. So having sex with different people or different animals, depending on your species, is a way of merging those cells. And then even at the cellular level, there's like a swing dance going on in order to create more diversity. It kind of really brings home the fact that sex is about creating diversity.
All right, let's give another round of applause for Chase. Take a couple minutes and then we'll get Jen up here.